So, thank you so much for inviting me to this. It feels a bit like returning to my roots because I did start in commercial radio and loved it. And although I did hop over the wall from local radio in Leeds to BBC local radio and then on to network radio, I've always had a great affinity for commercial radio. This is going to be a bit Radio 4-ish. It's just me and a lot of words. You'll just have to live with that. There are no commercial breaks. There's no clips. It's just me. But actually, one of the things I've really enjoyed was researching a bit about what's happening factually in terms of your radio. I mean, I always knew you were a radio-mad nation, but I actually hadn't realised quite how profoundly committed your audience is to radio. So where we live, Siobhan and I, UK radio listening is about, on average, 160 minutes a day, about 2.5 hours. In Norway, just switched over to DAB. It'll be really interesting to see if that extends listening time. With a slightly larger population than Ireland, it's 78 minutes a day, but both are dwarfed by the listening here at over 4 hours. So, as someone said earlier, you live your lives through radio. And I had my own personal experience of that. A few decades ago, my husband Steve and I were on holiday in the southwest, and we hit that moment that you occasionally get in the autumn here of brilliant blue skies and sunshine. And we spent our days tootling around the tiny lanes near Skibbereen and Bantry Bay, marvelling at the wild fuchsia and listening to the Irish playing out their latest national drama on radio. And my God, what a drama it was. It was the first Irish dirt banking scandal. For those of that you don't remember that, this was when the banks discovered they could attract more deposits by allowing local farmers, shopkeepers and doctors to sign a form claiming to be resident outside the country and therefore exempt from dirt. And every day, the phone-ins were alight. I mean, there was an inexhaustible supply of outrage. It was a kind of forerunner of social media on air. And frankly, I've rarely heard such eloquent savagery. This was the Irish talking to each other about what it was to be Irish in a modern state. And in some ways, it couldn't have been a more important conversation. And it was all happening on the radio. I think it was presented by Gay Byrne, who's pretty incomparable. But really, it was the relationship between the people phoning in with the scandal with each other. At times it felt intensely personal, like they were actually attacking someone who lived down the road, and you kind of felt they actually knew who'd signed those forms. But the programmes had an energy, a wit, and a sort of sardonic darkness, which was radio art for me. And I've remembered it because it showed the key strength of Irish radio then and now, which is you really understand your audiences. You understand what it is to be Irish in all the many deep and complex ways of the Irish. So there's nobody in this room doesn't know that radio generates a huge amount of affection and loyalty, and in my career that has at times been unnerving. When I was appointed as controller of BBC Radio 4, it was before email. I know that you'll find that hard to believe, but it's true. And I received many letters of welcome. The former Home Secretary, David Blunkett, personally wrote to me because as a blind person, radio and Radio 4 was incredibly important to him. The only other woman then to have been controller of Radio 4 wrote to me. Many men serving very long sentences at Her Majesty's pleasure wrote to me, because a lot of young offenders love commercial local radio, because I used to interview them. But if you're doing 20 years, you often move to speech radio and you fall in love with drama. It's very, very interesting. And a lot of regular Radio 4 listeners bothered to get in touch. And that is slightly different from sending an email. It's writing a letter. It's that bothering. And all of them wished me well, but with menaces. They made it abundantly clear that should I tamper with their beloved Radio 4, there would be dire consequences. So I did tamper, but very, very carefully. Jim Moyer, who used to run Radio 2, was a great radio impresario, used to say if you start to mess about with these very ancient but beloved radio brands, it's like separating mating hedgehogs, and there is some truth in that. And in doing so, I took radio to its highest ever audience at the time of 10 million listeners. Today, the radio figures are about 11 million people listening each week. And the station is still thriving despite the huge choice available to audiences. And some of this is down to demographics. So in the UK, we're an aging population with people living longer than ever before. I think within a relatively short period of time, we'll have over 1 million people over 100 in the UK. And that's incredibly good news for radio because it means those brought up with the radio habit, the baby boomers and beyond, should continue to listen pretty much as they've always done. They may alter their habits marginally, they may listen to more stations or spend less time with live radio as they discover the pleasures of podcasts or music streaming. But it's not unreasonable to assume they won't abandon old-fashioned radio for some time to come. And of course, we must never forget that divorce and death are incredibly good news for radio. More people are living alone for longer, which means radio's often unrecognised basic quality, which its sheer companionship, and this is true of music as well as speech radio, becomes incredibly important to listeners. I remember Greg Dyke, when he was Director General, telling me about a really dear friend of his who'd been recently widowed, so was on her own, and she was planning to move back to Ireland. And on her trips to view potential new homes, she always carried a radio in her very large handbag, which she would plug into each prospective house to test the signal for the radio. Now, because he was a telly man through and through, he thought this was bizarre. But as a radio woman, it didn't surprise me at all. And I think we need to treasure our older listeners. They offer a kind of fire break to give us space to figure out how to deal with the long-term challenge. And you know what that is. We've already begun to speak about it. It's how to make radio relevant to the under 45, especially the 17 to 24s who are not developing a strong radio habit. It's an increasingly acute problem for BBC Radio 1 and those commercial stations aimed at teenagers in the UK. Those teenagers take for granted music streaming and social. They have less time and much less attention for radio. So the latest UK radar audience figures show the 15 to 24s at their lowest ever level for all radio listening, at 80.3%. That is a very, very stark figure. And only a third of the UK's young audiences listen to a live radio programme in any week. And I got a flavour of that when I was running all of radio, because Radio 1 used to invite in groups of young people pretty much under 18, but sometimes under 24s, into Broadcasting House to just talk to them, to get their take on the world. You learn a lot from talking to your audience. And as director of radio, in that slightly Joyce Grenfell way, I'd ask enthusiastically, who here listens to radio? And not a single hand would ever go up. And of course they are listening. They're listening via their televisions, their computers, their phones and their tablets, but they don't see themselves as radio listeners in any conventional sense. And even here in Ireland, as I don't need to tell you, your figures show that young people are listening to significantly less radio for less time than a decade ago. And it would be very easy to panic in the face of what is the profound long-term challenge. But panic is always unwise. It's one thing I learned early on in the BBC. Instead, you have to anticipate change and adapt shrewdly. And there's a very important first step, I think, which is that it's important to remember what you do well right now. And it goes against the grain somewhat, because human beings, when they're anxious, tend to focus on the negative. It's what our brains do. We forget our own skills and experience and imbue our competitors with almost magical powers, which I would suggest is what some of those people who sell advertising are currently doing as they move money to digital. So it's really important to think incredibly hard about your current content and how to make it even better. So I've judged scores of radio awards over the years and listened to literally hundreds of hours of local and national radio made by the BBC and commercial programme makers. And what's exciting is to hear a familiar station, one with good audience or a brand that may be a little bit wobbly but pretty good, suddenly make a leap forward in sound, focus, energy, and self-confidence. And when you listen hard and you read what they've written and you unpick what they've done, it usually comes down to detail. A great presenter sounds more focused. The music policy is more appropriate for their audience. The humour, and there's always humour, is shared with the listener and not just between the station staff. We've all heard programmes where the listener appears to have been forgotten. We know it, we're all radio professionals. The more spontaneously brilliant a station sounds, the more planning and detailed work has gone into it. So Radio 1 has just gone through this process, and it has made a difference. After several years of declining young audiences and incredibly depressing, spiteful, gleeful headlines, the station has built audience for 4 quarters in a row, and Grimmy's breakfast show is on a bit of an upward trend. When I was leaving BBC Radio about a year ago, Radio 1's controller, a really good guy called Ben Cooper, had begun a root and branch examination of everything Radio 1 does to try to improve its creativity and impact. And I spoke to him earlier this week before I came here and just went through some of the things he's been doing over the last year that is making a bit of an impact. So they've tightened their links. They've focused and tightened their music policy. They've got a new sound package, different jingles. They've looked at their audience research in great depth. They know they can't reverse the drop in listening at home by 17 to 24-year-olds. That's never going to go in another direction. But they know that in-car listening by that group is holding steady. So they're capitalising on that. Ben has created what you might call family-friendly car zones in the afternoons and weekends when families are likely to be travelling together. And at those times, and you can hear it, Radio 1 belts out much-loved hits from the past and the present. The idea is to be cross-generational, so that the 10-year-old in the back seat, her grumpy 17-year-old brother, and their 40-something mother can all join in. Radio 1, in that way, feels very warm and pleasurable for the whole family. And of course, they've made a big noise about Radio 1, and they're lucky because the cross-media advertising that the BBC allows, because it's all the BBC, offers them a lot of choice and opportunity. They've used their 50th birthday as a perfect opportunity for that kind of celebration. But they've also created a month-long live lounge where great and rising stars make an impact every single day, both on air and online. Now, none of this is rocket science, and all of you probably do it all the time. You know when your brands are beginning to fade. You know when a programme begins to go on the wobble. But put simply, if you're up against it with young audiences, more than ever, you need to be firing on all cylinders creatively and constantly thinking about ways to refresh and reinvigorate. And the other thing I think you need to do is be very, very open to the external world and what impact it's having on your audience, which is one of the reasons we try to, in a very unscientific way, talk to the young. It's especially easy in a big organisation like the BBC to become dangerously insular and focused on the internal, and that way lies disaster. I have to say, getting this right is much easier if you have a leader who is obsessed with the external market and really understands changing technology and its implications. And I have worked for 7 Director Generals, and all of them had their different strengths and weaknesses, and you can bribe me later to tell you what they are. But undoubtedly, the modern leader who gave the BBC the long-term vision and strategy it still lives off was John Birt. And obviously he was running 23,000 people in a global organisation, but actually some of what I learned about leadership from him, not necessarily his personal style, but what he did, has always been useful. So he was almost Maoist in his education of his staff about how the world was changing and how that would affect the BBC's audiences. I was a baby reporter making radio current affairs programmes, but I sat through endless PowerPoint presentations about the shifting sands of the UK economy and culture and how in the end that would affect my audience, which of course it did. The other thing about John, he had a background in engineering, although he was a very inspired, both high-end and popular program maker. But he got, possibly because of that engineering background, very early in the 1990s, as the internet was just beginning, that the internet would change everything forever. And as a consequence, he made us all save 30% of our budgets to invest in digital radio, digital TV stations, and the BBC News website. Now, I know that since 2008 in this country, most of you will have been through unbelievably draconian cuts programs, and you know it's painful, and at least Bert's plan was about investing in the future, although at the time, I have to say, he and his plans were detested by most of the staff. A new generation regards him as visionary. And they regard him as visionary because that kind of foresightedness and determination to change through what is audience-focused change in the end, that strategy put the BBC years ahead of its competitors, and I think is one of the key reasons why the BBC still has 95% weekly reach in the UK. Later DGs built on that, Mark Thompson with the BBC Iplayer and Iplayer Radio, and Tony Hall in emphasising personalisation and the further development of the Iplayer. BBC Radio reframed its digital strategy several years ago, and so for us it's no longer about simply listening to content, it's about listen, watch and share. Radio 1 led the charge. It didn't wait for the BBC to invent its own apps. It launched on YouTube, really almost without telling anyone, and as a consequence now has 4 million subscribers on YouTube. And it's recognised as the world's most watched radio station. It's also got a combined audience of just under 8 million on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. Radio 2's strategy was slightly different, as you'd expect for a very different station aimed at a mass mid-market audience. And Radio 2 is a kind of phenomenon which I can't claim any credit for, but which I watch with a kind of awe. This year, its hours grew to a new record of 190 million. Nearly 1 in 5 of every hour listened to in the UK is to Radio 2. And it's the station I always point to when people claim that radio in the UK is in decline. And that audience loves live broadcasting. I was very interested to hear our colleague from Denmark talk about podcasting, and for some audiences it's wonderful, but we should never underestimate how powerful live broadcasting is for most of our audiences. They love live broadcasting and humour. If they want catch-up, mostly they want catch-up video. They want to see the Radio 2 in concert that was filmed either on the Red Button or on BBC 4 or on the iPlayer. And they associate that very strongly with the Radio 2 brand. 5 Live, our news and sports show, has made some progress in short form, what they call snackable content online, and Radios 3 and 4, our most public service stations, who don't get a huge amount of money for digital because it's mostly going towards the younger end, have done things like, Radio 4 did a big history of ideas, little 15-minute programs over a year, and they were accompanied by absolutely fantastic digital animations that have been watched over 3 million times on the Radio 4 website, YouTube, and Facebook. And we do have podcasts. I mean, Apple has told the BBC their podcasts are the most popular in those apps. And I'm saying those not because everything is working, but we are trying to adapt to a world that we know is changing faster than we kind of probably anticipated. But I don't think it's just about individual station brands. It's also about how the whole industry moves together. Siobhan touched on this in the last session. When I was director of BBC Radio, I built on the sterling work done by my predecessors in forging relations with commercial radio over big ticket investments. So the UK history of commercial radio has always been, until relatively recently, highly factionalised and often quite personally bitter. But there's been massive consolidation, as I'm sure all of you will know, and now it's really Bauer and Global, 2 private companies which hold the lion's share of the commercial market. And they compete very fiercely with each other and the BBC on programming, on creativity and brands. But they collaborate together and with the BBC, on expensive technology innovations like the radio player, which Siobhan talked about, and like DAB. And I'm not going to lie to you, collaboration can be really, really difficult. Just before I became radio director, the BBC stunned and frankly alienated its commercial partners by launching its own Iplayer radio app, which competes directly with its own joint venture. Try explaining that away, it's not easy. And there have been difficult wrangles between all the partners and Arqiva over the payment for the costly DAB infrastructure, and believe you me, it is very costly. But I really believe it's worth persevering with pan-industry collaboration on innovation, because UK radio is a very small element of a very big global media ecology. If radio as an industry pulls itself apart, it becomes even smaller and makes itself increasingly irrelevant. Your radio market, I'm no expert. It is complex and it is fragmented. And at this point, that may not matter very much. But as the digital platforms begin to eat into your audience time, as well as your advertising revenue, I worry that the fragmentation of the industry will make it harder to fight back, and certainly far more difficult to invest in big innovation. And innovation, both in content and technology, has always been the key to our long-term success. Which makes it a bit ironic that the most important recent innovation comes from the source of so much challenging disruption, the digital platforms. So a great piece of research work by the UK's Radio Centre shows that voice-activated devices like Echo or Alexa are increasing radio listening. The survey shows that once installed, Echo quickly becomes an important part of the daily family routine, usually in the room like the kitchen that the family moves most. Most people buy them for greater access to all audio entertainment, but in fact, it's radio that dominates listening on Echo. Yes, there is an increase in on-demand music, but radio accounts for over 70% of all Echo time spent with audio entertainment. Now, right now, only about 9% of the UK population has one or more of these devices, and it's typical take-up of new technology. It's men, highest amongst 25 to 44-year-olds, and those living in London or the South East, which are the affluent areas. But experts are predicting that this technology will become mainstream quite soon, hitting 40% penetration in UK households by later this year. So for me, that's an incredibly important development for radio, and frankly, one of the most cheering things I've heard in a long time. So let's answer the blunt question. Does radio have a long-term future? Well, yes, I would say it does, but it's not guaranteed, though I've been around long enough to know that nothing is guaranteed. What is certain is that if we don't continue to sniff the wind, to spot the shifts in audience habits, and to adapt, then over the decades, radio will cease to be irrelevant. Audio itself won't disappear. Hearing is a primary sense, and people have an enduring need for music, for storytelling, and for simple companionship. So for some time to come, radio as we know it now will meet those needs quite brilliantly. But you know, we once could predict that today's teenager would mature into tomorrow's radio listener. Well, today's 14-year-old is an enigma to everyone in media, not just radio people. She's a child who's grown up immersed in seamless digital technology and with digital skills and expectations which bear no relation to any generation before her. What will engage that 14-year-old when she's 24 is a total mystery. Giant media companies, far bigger than any of us, are spending billions of dollars trying to work that one out. What can we do? Well, we have to try to catch her now as much as we can and keep connecting as she develops. Her listening habit may be less ingrained than her parents', but it's not over. And as long as we're as good at watch and share as we are at listen, we have a fighting chance. And we have to keep in touch with that 14-year-old whilst maintaining our much deeper and more familiar connections with our older audiences, because as an industry, both audiences are vitally important to us. And if I had a few tips for survival, it would be these. Keep your curiosity about your audiences and their changing habits and technologies very high, because it will excite your creativity. Keep your paranoia about the future as low as you can, otherwise it will kill your confidence. Pray for a visionary leader, though you won't necessarily enjoy the experience. And hold fast to the idea that radio will remain important to numerous listeners for a long time to come, especially here in Ireland. Your challenge right now is to convince your advertisers of that. And above all, be confident that you have the creativity and the capacity to ride out these very, very turbulent changes. I've left the industry. You can tell I still love it. I wish you great good luck. Radio is really worth fighting for.
Thank you very much, Helen. That was really inspiring. I've realised that I am that woman of an age driving her kids around the car. Hoping for a track that we can all listen to. If anybody has any questions for Helen Boaden, we have 2 mics on either side. So if you want to put up your hands. And
over there, gentleman over there.
Hello, Helen.
Hi.
Well done. Fantastic speech.
Thank you.
My name is Andy Matthews from Classic Hits and Sunshine. The question you mentioned, just in relation to the BBC, you said not everything is working. Any insights into that?
Well, it's when you're plotting a strategy, you get some things wrong. So I think, I'll give you an example from the past, but it's still relevant. We assume a greater appetite for long-form programmes in catch-up than actually exists. We've assumed that. Actually, one of the things I think that the BBC is in danger of is not understanding the difference between the way people consume television and consume radio. So as it talks about rightly bringing everything into Iplayer, it has to have the technology to make sure that you can listen to your radio station live or catch up with it, not just do the catch up, which is what most people do with television catch up. So there's a kind of the danger when you are a big organisation with a lot of money and people whose, frankly, consumer habits are completely different from their audiences, that you extrapolate from your own experience to think that that's where most people are. I would say right now it's very important that the BBC does a lot around podcasts, but if it thinks that podcasts is the future for all audio, it's wrong. Podcasts may have a very, very profound impact in speech radio, but for music and live music, I believe is going to be very, very important. So that could become, they might pursue the wrong strategy because they're looking at television rather than radio. The BBC is notorious for loving radio and honouring it and not really understanding how people use it. So that's the kind of thing. I think the other thing I worry about is the BBC is in danger of forgetting that it is there to do some things that the market doesn't do. It's there to be distinctive. And although it's very important to see your major rivals as the digital platforms, the Amazons, the Netflix, Deezer, Spotify, those things, that's what I mean about sniffing out the wind. You really need to understand the impact of those. You also need to know that you get £3 billion a year to do things that neither they nor the market delivers. And I would worry if the BBC competed too directly on the territory that at the moment a lot of commercial radio does. So I'm glad that Radio 1 is tightening its music policy. If it simply replicated the music policy of commercial radio, I think that would be very inappropriate, to use a tactful term. That's not what we get the money for. But I'm very old-fashioned these days, it has to be said. Anything else?
Hi, Helen. Fiona
Hi.
from Radio Kerry. Just to tie in, I suppose, a bit with the last panel too. So earlier on this year, with the help of Learning Waves and the BAI through their Media Literacy Fund, we were able to do a week for transition year students where we brought them into the station for a week. They had a studio, they had a trainer, and they had access to everybody in the station, and they had 2 blank hours of private high radio at the end of the week that they filled completely themselves.
Yeah.
We had no idea what they were going to do, how they did it. Guests cancelled on them, things weren't right, things went wrong. But by the end of it, the learning was huge for us in terms of the way they approached stories and how they did them and social media. But they were buzzing. It was Facebook by 1,000 because it wasn't just their friends that they shared their thoughts with. The whole county heard them and heard them in real time and stuff like that. But I suppose my question is how, especially if you're a commercial station, independent station, you balance the time to innovate and do all those things that we all would love to do, and we'll all go away from here tomorrow buzzing with ideas, with the furnace that is the station that's live and has to go out on air all day. But also, I think you touched on it yourself, how you innovate without alienating your core audience.
Well, it's a difficult challenge, but it's one you've already been doing because you're still on air. So first of all, be aware. I mean, that's a brilliantly innovative idea. There's a sort of idea that when you do some stuff about creativity with Linda, who's an old colleague from the BBC here, that creativity and innovation is either what some people do or takes a long time. It's not. Really good ideas generation, really good creativity can be done fast and furiously. There are techniques for developing day-to-day ideas. The bigger challenge, and actually if you get them right, they will appeal to both sorts of audiences. The bigger challenge is the costly innovation that the industry needs to do. So if you don't have not much money, even the capacity of someone doing really effective social media for your station is a bit of time that they no longer have to think about the radio. And that's where the challenge can be difficult. And that's where, so I'll give you an example of where another thing we got wrong. When I first became director of radio, everyone was tweeting like mad because Twitter had just taken off. It was so boring, I can't tell you. I mean, if you were interested in a Radio 4 programme, you just felt you were being machine gunned by Twitter. And then slowly people realised that one great tweet that makes people laugh or makes them do something different is worth 50 anodyne, ridiculous tweets. So there's something about targeting your creativity that helps you get the time balance right. But it's genuinely never easy, particularly if you're on a small station with not many people. And the one thing you don't want to get to, I've just come back from Tokyo where I was working with the public service, well, I was talking to them. And they've just had a young woman die. And they've got this very extraordinary culture in Tokyo about presenteeism and working long hours. But actually, when you looked at this sort of the intensity of how she was working, it clearly had contributed to her death. So one of the key elements about creativity is that you also need the lulls and the shape that allows you to develop an idea slightly outside of the frenzy of day-to-day broadcasting. You don't need loads of time, but you need enough. And the thing you most need is to find techniques to generate hundreds of good ideas, hundreds of ideas, even if 90% of them are rubbish. I can't emphasize enough, actually, if any of you are thinking of not going to the creativity session, we did a big project under Greg Dyke about increasing people's, at the BBC, the tools and techniques for creativity. And the people who benefited from it most were local radio people who have the lowest budgets and the smallest teams. And they said it was transformational. So, just even things like coming in for a morning meeting and kind of how you use that first 10 minutes to get better ideas. So good luck on it. It's a great project you just did. What was your key learning from it? What was the thing you learned most from them?
Their energy, and nothing was impossible. You know, if they wanted the minister, they put in a request for the minister. And but also I think they learned loads about radio because I think maybe they perceived it as being old-fashioned or not for them, whereas they actually just found it so real, so live, so instant, and the people they were engaging with were much bigger than any social media forum they were using.
Well, see, one of the things that you'd done is you'd linked your social media to your own brand, which is a much bigger brand than any sort of most individual Facebooks, and that's a very powerful thing. Our BBC 3 experiment, which is a telly thing, but it is quite a lesson in how hard it is to make an impact if all you're doing is using social media and digital, because BBC 3 is doing brilliantly with its films on Iplayer, which is the equivalent of watching the telly, but actually its social media can have very, very good days, but also can have very, very low days, because it's really hard to make a sustained impact with social media. You need these much bigger brands that are television or radio stations to make the impact. I'm getting that sound. Shut up, Helen. Well, thank you very much for having me. I've really enjoyed it. Take care.
Thank you, Helen.